From the end of the Renaissance to this day, we have a vast catalog of music in many styles. This is known as classical music. Here is where we also have some of the best composers in history. The common misconception about classical music is that it all sounds the same. However, throughout the hundreds of years and many composers who have contributed to classical music, there are many different genres that will be explored in this video today. There are four eras of classical music. The first era is the Baroque era. The general timeline of this period is between 1600 and 1750. Some of the great composers from this era were Antonio Vivaldi, Claudio Monteverdi, and Georg Friedrich Handel. The most famous composer of the Baroque era was Johann Sebastian Bach. This era of music was seen as a time of creation and experimentation for classical music. Polyphony, playing multiple sounds at once, had replaced the old ancient styles of music where you would hear instruments and voices playing in unison. Also, music had more of a form, which allowed listeners to follow the music easier than ever. The harpsichord was the primary instrument of this era, which is an early ancestor of the piano. Operas were created around this time, and other new musical styles such as concertos, sonatas, and motets were also created. The orchestra was in its early years as well, and this helped composers with experimenting and evolving new styles of music into the next era. The next time period was the classical era. This era was the shortest of all the time periods, only lasting from 1750 to the 1810s. However, the composers and music to come from this time period shaped music in a major way. Many of the great composers from this era were Franz Joseph Haydn, Joseph Chavert St. George, Johann Christian Bach, and the famous Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Opera had evolved with the introduction of opera buffa, and smaller groups of musicians were being formed to perform chamber music. The orchestra at this time had added more instruments such as brass and woodwinds. This led to the creation of the symphony, which allowed composers to showcase multiple genres of music in one long song. Music that would feature a soloist or multiple soloists were also being written and would allow a composer to showcase what instruments could do. Because of how instruments were evolving, the music sounded much more fluent and connected, unlike the Baroque era. The following time period was the Romantic era. This was a time period from the 1810s to the 1900s. The composer who had led the shift to this era of music was Ludwig van Beethoven, and he did it with the help of the piano. While it was invented around the 1700s, composers were still primarily using the harpsichord, but the piano had become more popular as it had a deeper and more connecting sound, and Beethoven was able to bring out the piano's true potential. Other composers of the Romantic era included Franz Schubert, Johannes Brahms, Johann Strauss Jr., and Clara Schumann. Great opera composers of the time were Gioacchino Rossini, Georges Bizet, and Giacomo Puccini. Instruments at this time had received their modern designs, and it enhanced the sound of the orchestra, giving it richer and deeper sounds. New styles of dance, such as the waltz, polka, and gallop, and more, were created during this time period. All these new creations allowed composers to experiment with what music had to offer and create many new styles that further evolved classical music as a whole. While we are in modern times, classical music has continued to evolve since the 1900s. There were composers like Dmitri Shostakovich and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who were more traditional classical composers. But in America, new styles of music were being created, starting with John Philip Sousa. He created and standardized the style in which military march music was written and created over 150 songs in that style that many composers follow to this day. There were other composers like Igor Stravinsky of Russia and Carlos Chavez, the composer of Mexico, who experimented with 12-tone and avant-garde style, which is a highly experimental style of music and is very unconventional. It uses every note in music and is also known as atonal music. However, with the rise of jazz and Broadway, you add composers like William Grant Still, Florence Beatrice Price, Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, and Leonard Bernstein, who understood that less people were listening to traditional classical music and started mixing jazz into their music and created all new styles of music for their audiences. Whether it be for Broadway, a large performance, they understood the changing times and evolved with it. Now, as we reach today, classical music survives in many different formats, the most popular being movie music. Composers like John Williams, Hans Zimmer, Danny Elfman, and Alan Silvestri can write classical music but involve modern styles of music to allow a modern audience to enjoy it. This will allow classical music to always survive and evolve with the times and be a part of modern culture.